Dramatic, violent, and made for TV, football is the lifeblood of American sport. 6 months a year, millions don their pads and march into the arena for the millions more that gather in celebration of our modern gladiators. Fueled by a primal thirst for combat and passion that runs so deep it can divide friends and unite foes, the game has an unyielding, unwavering grip on American hearts. On top of high schools bringing in thousands of dollars and colleges millions and tens of millions, professional football is a sporting behemoth that stands peerless. The NFL's closest competitors don't even come within 70% of per club revenue or 30% per game. It's a complete and utter annihilation. So thoroughly do they outpace the field that it stands to reason that someone must challenge their supremacy and lay claim to even a fraction of that fortune. Yet, as the years go by, none do. In fact, none have for nearly half a century. This is the story of the last that dared dream such big dreams, the last great gridiron incursion, one of wanton ambition and fearlessness in the face of horribly long odds, even to their own detriment. Cautionary as much as it is instructive, this is the story of the USFL and football's war to end all wars. Like its real-life counterpart, football's war only became possible through many years of consolidation and development. Far-flung as it may seem, the professional game wasn't always a money-printing club for the 1%, or even extraordinarily popular. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, professionalism was seen as the common man's blight on the sport, an aberrant perversion of the Ivy League's beloved pastime. Many of the game's earliest professional teams were either boycotted by the AAU or bankrupted by their own overzealousness. The first professional league, an all-Pennsylvania affair serendipitously known as the NFL, lasted only 1 year, with all 3 teams folding. It failed so dramatically that it catalyzed a statewide shift back to baseball for decades. Somewhat stable regional alliances formed in the blue-collar cities of Ohio, Illinois, and New York, but still, football was a losing game snake-bitten by an overabundance of top-level teams and their own profligacy. It wasn't until 1920, 28 years after the first player was paid, that the clubs finally decided to stand up against their long march to insolvency. Applying lessons learned from Major League Baseball's formative years, pioneering executives like Ralph Hay and Art Ranney proposed that the teams in the sport would be better off cooperating, at least somewhat, rather than competing for every last dollar. Together, they insisted, the Ohio League teams and their strongest competitors from around the Rust Belt could keep salaries under control, generate fan investment, and one day challenge baseball's behemoth. To some extent, they were right. Though many teams still folded and upstart rivals now look to the NFL's teams as targets rather than partners, the league itself gave the game some semblance of stability. Gradually, the balance of power shifted from the original Ohio League teams to those in major cities capable of drawing tens of thousands of spectators and all the best from the college ranks. So entrenched did their power become that, from consolidation in 1927, they wouldn't face another major challenger until after the Second World War. Even then, the NFL managed to outlast the AAFC's deeper pockets and flashier locales thanks to stone-willed men like Tim Mara and Art Rooney, who knew their wealth and legacies were intertwined with the fate of their football teams, and thus fought harder to defend them. It wouldn't be until a decade later that another challenger stepped up to face the now battle-tested NFL. Primarily broadcast on the ever more ubiquitous television, football rapidly closed the gap to baseball in the 1950s, seemingly positioned to become America's most popular sport sometime in the near future. Staring down an order of magnitude increase in earnings potential, again the contemporary entrepreneur was drawn to the gridiron. Self-made oilmen and privately educated heirs alike wanted nothing more than to bring football to their towns and to supplement their bottomless fortunes. Unwilling to expand, however, only recently having found sustainable success, the NFL offered no supply to meet that demand. Faced with no other options, the men decided to spend their money instead on their own ball clubs in their own league. Driven by glamorous dreams and, like its predecessor, backed by a much larger pool of money, the new American Football League set out to take the sport by storm. The owners didn't just want to make money, though. They wanted to be seen, heard, and eventually vindicated. The NFL's owners, after all, had been openly hostile following the death of Commissioner Burt Bell, and the AFL's Foolish Club had a score to settle. And settle they did. Before a ball was kicked, the AFL wrote its name in lights, luring away Rams' first overall selection, Billy Cannon, winner of the 1959 Heisman Trophy. Despite middling attendances and lower broadcast revenues, the AFL continued to press their financial advantage, signing more superstar collegians, like Alabama's Joe Namath, to further legitimize their football insurrection. Under AFL Commissioner Al Davis, it got even more inimical, seeing the AFL pry away several of the NFL's most important players and biggest stars. Secretly, the ownership groups decided they had had enough. Winning Al Davis's war was a matter of ego, not bottom line. He was surely going to bankrupt both leagues. After 6 long and hostile years, the two adversaries joined anew, uniting under common leadership for 1966 and common ownership for 1970. It was certain to be the last great challenger of the NFL. The league had proven itself immune to competition, in court and on the field. Its combined ownership was the perfect mixture of brash and tempered, wealthy and modest. All who dared stand in its path were chewed up and spit out, failing to complete more than one single season. With the league's ballooning finances now on all 3 major TV networks, you would have to be irredeemably arrogant or unbelievably reckless to face the machine they had created. Or maybe just the right amount of both. Down in New Orleans, and largely unknown to the broader football world, there was perhaps the lone operative that fit that bill. David Dixon, a small-time local businessman, had lost many of his best years to an obsession for professional football. Beginning in the 1950s, Dixon incessantly lobbied New Orleans' local government and community for material support in pursuit of a pro franchise. First came a mayoral commission, aimed initially at building a baseball stadium on Lake Pontchartrain. Dixon, as silver-tongued as any, managed to shift Mayor Morrison's focus from baseball to football, arguing that Tulane, who had recently opted to walk back their commitment to the SEC, had an already built pro-ready football facility sitting practically dormant. Though neither Morrison's stadium or Dixon's 1961 bid for the AFL's Oakland Raiders came to pass, he continued to lean heavily on his carefully curated football Rolodex. The next year, Lamar Hunt, the brains behind the AFL, asked Dixon to spearhead his Dallas Texans' potential move to New Orleans, but Tulane officials were unwilling to gamble on the league, insisting it was losing far too much money for their sensibilities, and Hunt was pushed to Kansas City. Dixon found his football dreams at a crossroads. Tulane was firm in their desire to host only the more reputable NFL, but the NFL and New Orleans weren't exactly a great culture fit. The league and its owners were champions of an integrated game, but Louisiana was still very much segregated and preferred to stay that way. In time, he managed to convince the Ford family, owners of the Detroit Lions and generous university patrons, to apply financial pressure on Tulane's board. The result? Preseason NFL football in an integrated Tulane stadium. Not only that, but highly attended preseason NFL football. So impressed was NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle that he offered New Orleans a deal. Get Congressman Boggs, their representative and the House Majority Whip, to push the NFL's merger through, and the city could at last have its team. Dixon briefly held a slight interest in the Saints, whose rights were purchased by Texas oil heir John Mecum Jr., but he couldn't be satisfied by the mere illusion of power. Like a shark, Dixon needed to keep swimming, and swim he did. As a further concession to Rozelle, Dixon and Louisiana Governor John McKeithen had promised to build an indoor stadium to protect the team's games from New Orleans' brutal weather. And naturally, Dixon placed himself in charge. 5 years of politicking, 4 years of construction, and $134 million later, the Superdome, a physical embodiment of his commitment to his city and his game, opened its doors. But what was he to do now? Dixon had spent the last 20 years putting his pro football scheme into play, inch by grueling inch. He had developed the contacts, skills, and his understanding of the industry to such a degree that he stood nearly peerless. Besides Hunt and Rozelle, there was not another person on earth that had been so involved in every facet of professional football. The only logical next step, it appeared, was to find his way back into the game, and after years of careful planning, he found it. The AAFC, the AFL, even the misguided World Football League had all tried to challenge the NFL for eyes, setting up camp in their cities during their season. Dixon thought that to be asinine. He figured that there was a real market for football to be played in the spring and summer, opposite the NFL calendar, that could blaze its own path without the Death Star looming overhead. And so he took to his schemes again. Dixon saw clearly what would make this league a compelling product to its fans and investment to its owners, what would make it more than just an idea in his head. First and foremost was money, lots of it. Ownership groups needed to be able to sustain significant losses, as the AFL had, in order to keep the creditors at bay and make it to a second TV deal. The second TV deal was crucial. Anything before that was just a speculative investment without proof of concept. To that end, teams needed to be placed in markets that would make for an expensive second TV deal. Respectfully, what good would short term financial stability do for you if your long term projections relied on TV viewers in Lincoln, Nebraska or Cheyenne, Wyoming? Considerations were also given to football credibility, hiring college Hall of Famer John Ralston to coach a team to be named later, and perhaps excessive marketing, fearing the kiss of death that would be empty bleachers. A plan carefully crafted and begging for execution, the birth of the United States Football League was set in motion. As Dixon had predicted, there was no shortage of interest in his new league. In the end, spring schedule or not, American entrepreneurs of the 1980s loved a lottery ticket. Cable pioneers, the chairman of Sotheby's, real estate magnates, and even oil tycoons all happily paid up for their chance at football immortality. Many fortunes had been lost in sport, especially in competitor leagues, but the men believed that Dixon's stern rule and the controversy surrounding the NFL's 1982 lockout would make this a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. 12 groups signed on in 12 cities for Season 1, most in the nation's brightest media hotspots, with an additional 4, including Dixon's own club, scheduled to follow in 1984. New Commissioner Chet Simmons, once the president of a fledgling ESPN and a trailblazer in sports programming, signed distribution agreements with ABC for Sunday games and ESPN for the remaining inventory, marking their first foray into live regular season sports. Takeoff for the USFL, at the very least, appeared to be smooth and steady. At the conclusion of the 1983 season, its success showed up on paper too. The USFL's zig to the NFL's no fun league zag proved more engaging than anyone could have ever imagined. Viewership and attendance, the league's primary revenue drivers, both significantly exceeded what they had outlined as necessary for viability. Though the Boston Breakers had to move to New Orleans, failing to gain approval to use Harvard Stadium, Dixon's model proved wildly successful, seeing no teams fold in Season 1. Their prospects weren't hurt, of course, by the quality of football put on display. They had managed to unearth overlooked stars like 5'9 linebacker Sam Mills, an eventual Hall of Famer, and bring in some of the college game's best to offset the lower average quality of player. The Dixon plan, by all accounts, should have been easily converting this early success into real stability. But you know what they say about plans. Everyone has one until they're hit in the face. Dixon had spent years so consumed by detailing every last step, every day, every hour of the process that he forgot to consider the most important variable of all: free will. What was he to do when someone inevitably decided they knew better and sidestepped his authority? The odd, lavish signing, like Heisman Trophy winner Herschel Walker or Miami superstar Jim Kelly, he'd been able to account for. The AFL, after all, made similar signings in Billy Cannon and Joe Namath that helped cement the league's legitimacy. He could not imagine, however, the problems that making these small concessions would invite upon the young league. Having seen the success these concessions brought, especially in the form of Walker, the league's 1983 rushing champion, spending was poised to seriously ramp up. It was only a natural reaction to knowing that they could pry stars away from the NFL. Many of the original owners Dixon hand-selected for their willingness to walk the line now could not keep up with the demands of owning a franchise. They had very specifically planned and been vetted for the $1.8 million salary cap, playing within which would now surely yield a last-place team and no attendance. Their exodus proved a turning point for the league. Dixon's core tenets of moderation and order were categorically thrown out. Dixon was thrown out. At his own request, the league bought out his franchise rights. He was disgusted with how easily the owners had done away with his vision, overexpanding for a little quick cash, and flagrantly disregarding its spending rules in a manner he was sure would lead to their demise. Investors didn't care, though. Its style was attractive, ostentatious. It could make you a little money, and now it was for sale at a great price without the overbearing godfather looking over your shoulder. It was too good of a deal to pass up. The old guard, like Denver's Ron Blanding and Arizona's Jim Joseph, quickly gave way to an entirely new class, one with deep pockets and even deeper personality, one unmoved by the threat of dipping even further into the red to feed their own egos, one personified best by new Generals owner Donald Trump. Long before The Apprentice or politics, Trump was a world-famous playboy. Weighed down by a mountain of family real estate cash and with a model wife willing to help lighten that load, Trump was an ever-present fixture in the tabloids of the day. Only serving to heighten that stature was the recent completion of Trump Tower, a luxurious centerpiece for the Manhattan skyline sandwiched right against Tiffany's flagship store on Fifth Avenue. He was in the real papers. He was in the gossip magazines. He was the news. And boy, did he want to let everyone know. In his eyes, the small-timing, nickel-and-diming, miserly planning was far beneath a man of his stature. He wanted to send this thing nuclear, to the level of the NFL, and he wanted to be in the middle of it. The attention Trump brought to the league made that possible. Believing all press to be good press, the owners rallied behind his force of will. For 1984, he replaced Dixon as the USFL's slightly less invisible hand, and he was going to run things his own way. That started with his ball club. New York needed to be the biggest and flashiest team in the league, laden with stars on the field, sidelines, and front office if any of this was going to work. Fortunately, he already had the league's biggest star in tailback Herschel Walker, so the focus needed only to be on putting pieces in place to help showcase the second-year pro's supernatural ability. First came a head coach. To attract the ilk of player Trump sought to build the Generals around, there needed to be a coach with the bona fides to match, one that the fans could recognize to boot. Who better to call than reigning Super Bowl champion Joe Gibbs? In just 2 years, he had taken Washington from a meager 6-10 to top of the football mountain. Surely, he could deliver what Trump so badly desired. Surely he could, but he wasn't going to. Who better than the runner-up, Don Shula? He had 4 times been NFL Coach of the Year and held the post long enough in Miami where things could have simply gone stale. Unfortunately, negotiations soured after Trump very publicly declared on television that Shula was ready to pack his bag for New York if only they could get the money right.
It's really a question of whether or not I want to pay a certain price.
According to some, he even cast his sights on reigning college football national champion Joe Paterno, who quickly declined. Eventually, the team landed on a middle ground option, hiring former New York Jets head coach Walt Michaels, who'd taken the locals to the playoffs in '82. Leadership sorted, it was then about getting the men. Quarterbacks Jeff Napple and Bobby Scott were abysmal in '83, combining to throw for only 10 touchdowns and 26 interceptions. That had to change. Again, a delicate balance needed to be struck between a high-caliber football player and one with national notoriety. Lacking a first-round pick, having renounced it to sign Walker, Trump and Michaels set their eyes on disgruntled Browns signal caller Brian Sipe. Despite winning the 1980 MVP award, the Browns were quick to hook the San Diego State product in '82 after a rough start. Though he won the job back in '83, Trump resolved to give their relationship no time to recover. Playing on the lack of faith shown by coach Sam Rutigliano and timing the negotiations to further enrage Art Modell, the Generals managed to get his name on the dotted line. They got so confident that they even made a run at signing Giants All-Pro linebacker Lawrence Taylor to a futures contract. Although Taylor's deal quickly collapsed, with Walker, Michaels, and Sipe and an injection of NFL talent across the roster, the team was widely regarded as the league's best, favored to win it running away. For the other owners, that was a problem. See, Trump wasn't the only one with an ego or an existential need to win. Both the new owners, like billionaires J. William Oldenburg and Edward DeBartolo Sr., and those struggling for attendance, like Philadelphia's Miles Tannenbaum, desperately needed to keep up with the Generals Joneses. Oldenburg's LA Express brought in Super Bowl winning general manager Don Klosterman and handed him a blank check. Targeting many of the nation's best collegians, they assembled one of the most expensive rosters in the history of professional sports, highlighted by, they hoped, the league's next Herschel Walker, BYU quarterback Steve Young. Pittsburgh tried to sign hometown kid Dan Marino, but struck out, forcing them to settle for Nebraska's Heisman Trophy winning tailback Mike Rozier. Oklahoma even signed the NCAA's leading rusher Ernest Anderson. A massive spending war was underway, and one that would fundamentally alter the landscape of the young league. And it all played right into Trump's hand. When he bought the Generals, Trump had no intention of playing spring football. He didn't want to just rival the NFL as a product. He wanted to meet them on the field. His excessive spending wasn't about increasing the profile of the USFL or one day overtaking the NFL. That would be ludicrous. On the balance of the evidence, it had made no difference on that front at all. Attendances weren't going up, viewership wasn't going up, and the money wasn't rolling in. No, the only way this investment, in the way they had treated it, would pay off is if they forced the NFL to quite literally play ball. Signing the best college players, starting bidding wars for basically every QB in the league, and raiding its front offices were actions best described as kicking the hornet's nest, letting them know that the USFL was there and that they were ready to ruin it for everyone. Trump never could have foreseen the owners so readily backing themselves into this corner with him, and now they had no choice but to play his game. Staring down the barrel of their own mortality, the league officially voted to institute a new era of the USFL. Dixon plan be damned, now, for better or for worse, they were on the Trump plan. Phase 1, catch their attention, had already been successful. Big spending ran up the NFL's payrolls and forced Commissioner Pete Rozelle to change the league's draft rules. It was time, then, for Phase 2. Trump wanted to play fall football directly against the NFL and start a war for the fans. There was a ton of evidence suggesting that playing through the NFL season could work. Several times in its infancy, the National League and eventually Major League Baseball proved susceptible to rival leagues. They leached coverage, fans, revenue, and in many cases, it was easier to merge than continue the fight. Football had a similar experience with the AFL in the 1960s, seeing many of the intra-city rivalries devolve into rock fights. The problem was that there was substantially more evidence suggesting that it wouldn't work. That was the whole reason Dixon originally insisted on playing in the spring. It would have been one thing playing over them in the 50s or 60s when the fan bases were younger and revenue differentials smaller, but Dixon, who lived a decade knee-deep in that exact scenario, knew the time to strike against the Shield had passed. He was just a small-time bumpkin from down south, though. Could he have known better than a room full of billionaires in Manhattan? There was only one way to find out. The USFL moved forward with plans to play a fall season. There wasn't enough time to get the ball rolling for '85, so the season continued as scheduled with an eye on an '86 full transition. It wasn't all business as usual, however. There were major preemptive changes made in preparation for the switch. Though teams continued to sign stars, like Heisman Trophy winner Doug Flutie, the purse strings did tighten. San Antonio was based out of a double-wide in their stadium's parking lot and riding a school bus to practice. Franchises in cities like Pittsburgh, where having a second team would be suicide, or with owners unwilling to play Trump's game, were folded and merged into the league's non-NFL markets. It was going to take total buy-in to survive the coming onslaught, and any dead weight would likely sink the ship. Dixon's commissioner was fired, a new CBA was drafted, and Eddie Einhorn, future owner of a Chicago Phoenix franchise, was sent to reaffirm their TV partner's commitment. All hands were on deck, working tirelessly to reach the endgame in one piece. And it simply didn't work. The football was fine. The players were still talented. It was still the same product, but 1985 turned out to be a perfect storm of Trump's worst nightmares. Something about the combination of well-publicized financial issues, the change in format, and a lengthy layover on the horizon bled the league dry. Fans simply weren't as interested anymore, to a whole different extent than in '84. All of their leverage to negotiate a new TV deal evaporated, and the owners could do little but stand around and scratch their heads. The situation was bleak. Nearly every team west of the Mississippi was facing bankruptcy and trying to fold. Tampa was actually bankrupt and having their assets seized by the sheriff, while one of their co-owners fought terminal brain cancer and the other killed himself to avoid securities fraud charges. Birmingham needed to be bailed out by the city because its owner's bank was bled dry by that securities fraud. He hoped it wouldn't come to this, but it was time for Trump to play his final card. His interest in football had waned. It was a miserable and financially taxing experience that he would be better off leaving behind for good. Without his team in New York, the TV deal, and by extension the league, was dead. So instead of a merger, it was time to take part in America's real pastime: litigation. The NFL's owners had blatantly intended to ruin the league, allegedly even pressuring its TV partners to keep a wide berth. The USFL had memos, owner testimony, even meeting minutes suggesting monopolistic behavior. They might as well have had an actual smoking gun. Still, the trial went on for 48 days. The USFL, the defense argued, put itself into this position through gross mismanagement and unwillingness to play the long game. They believed that the professional football monopoly was a natural monopoly, one which relied on decades of brand recognition and consumer loyalty, rather than one the NFL had conspired to create. After deliberating for 5 days, the jury agreed. The NFL had become a monopoly, but had not engaged in anti-competitive practices to prevent the USFL from succeeding. The league was awarded $1 single in nominative damages, and with that, the $1 football league was dead. Only Vince McMahon has tried to challenge the NFL in the years since, albeit insincerely. His XFL aimed to translate his WWE Attitude Era flair, which had made him billions, into football, but was always going to be a gimmick. Minor leagues, as Dixon had first envisioned, are all the sport can now sustain. Even then, none have yet survived. I guess it's a story of hubris more than anything. A tale of the dangers of trying to be something you're not. The USFL flew so close to the sun. They brought an energy back to football that stuffy old men had tried so hard to legislate away. They advanced players' conditions and fan experiences in a way that so few could have imagined when some wiry businessman from New Orleans laid it all out. In the end, though, they suffered the same fate as Icarus. Pride and ego carried them to their doom.